All righty, well, we'll get started. Thank you once again for everyone for joining us today for our second EV Smart webinar in Michigan and Ohio. Today will be covering the topic of EV charging planning. So all the considerations that need to go in as we're thinking about installing charging infrastructure. Our agenda for today is we'll do a quick brief welcome, and then we have Emily Pape from the Electrification Coalition here to talk to us and give us a wonderful presentation about charging considerations. And there'll be time at the end for like discussion, questions and answers that you might have. So as we're going through the presentation, feel free to just throw your questions in the chat and we can make sure that those get answered for you towards the end of the presentation. Speaking of questions, though, I have two requests. If you could change your Zoom name to include the community that you're representing, that can be helpful for people on the call to know who's asking the question, could maybe help you connect with your neighboring communities or peer communities. How you can do that is on your Zoom screen. If you move your mouse to the top right corner, there's an icon that will pop up that has 3 dots. If you click on that, a menu will appear and there's an option that says rename. Additionally, if you have questions off the top of your head right now that you want to make sure get answered in today's webinar, go ahead and just throw those in the chat now so we can make sure and get those responded to you. And Emily, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. If something urgent comes up, I'll let you know. But without further ado, then I'll give everyone a few more moments to fulfill those 2 requests that I had. But otherwise, I'll be passing the reins over to Emily for the presentation. So Emily, I will stop sharing and then I think I gave you permissions to share.
Perfect. Okay, let's see here. Okay. Okay, there we go, except I'm on slide 3. Whoops. All right, perfect. Well, like Rebecca said, I'm here to talk about EV charging planning. My name is Emily Pape. I've worked with, I think, a number of you on the Ohio side of things. So nice to see your Zoom squares this morning. But just for those of you who have not worked with us in the past, or maybe aren't familiar with our work, the Electrification Coalition, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. And our main objective is to develop and implement a broad set of strategies in order to facilitate the widespread adoption of electric vehicles in order to overcome the economic, public health, and national security challenges that stem from America's dependence on oil. So our goal really surrounds transportation electrification with the aim of not using fossil fuels anymore. That's our whole goal. So to accomplish this, we play a number of roles. Here are a few of the things that we work on. We are a technical lead for fleets. We work on policy at all levels of government. This is now jumping around on its own. Sorry about that. We work also in like freight and port electrification and have advocacy and education, and then work on a number of projects. So, and now to kind of just really dive into the EV charging planning that we're going to talk about today, I wanted to start with just some basic background. I'm assuming most of you are going to be familiar with some of these things I'm going to cover, but just to make sure everybody's starting from the same page, thought I'd start with just charging levels explained, because I know we throw around like level 1, level 2, DC fast charging, and just want to make sure we're all talking about the same thing here today. So level 1 chargers are just what you would plug into your standard home outlet. So what you charge your computer on, or you plug any appliances in your kitchen. That's what level 1 charging uses. And so this, for a typical EV, would get you about 5 miles over the course of an hour if you're charging. So then level 2 is bumped up a bit. That would use a 240 volt circuit. And those are the plugs that you would see for your like dryer or maybe your stove. And so those just a little bit heftier. And charging at one of these will get you 25 to 45 miles over the course of an hour. And so this is kind of this middle ground between level 1 and then our next bump up, which is direct current fast charging, usually referred to as DC fast charging or DCFC. And these use 480 volt circuits and will get you about 40 or more miles, depending on the vehicle, over the course of 10 minutes. And so these are pretty much only found at public charging stations, maybe some fleet depots, but this isn't something you're going to install in your garage because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So then we're also talking about, charging levels, but also charging ports, because we are in a little bit of the Wild West when it comes to charging connectors at this point. But that's okay. That's very manageable. So you see this J1772, and this almost all vehicles have. I've listed a couple of manufacturers there. We also have the Chatamo connector for DC fast charging. And this connector you really only see in the Nissan Leaf. It's kind of phasing out, isn't necessarily one we're going to be seeing in newer vehicles. And then you also see the CCS combo, and you see there that this has kind of the similar to the J1772, but then also has that DC fast charging capability. And this was kind of what a lot of vehicles will have. Again, some other manufacturers listed there. But then you also have the NACS or Tesla or J3400. We have a lot of catchy names for this one. And this is the connector that you're seeing a lot of automakers adopt now, that originally was Tesla's charging connector. And so we have a couple listed here. Tesla charging stations this year are starting to be opened to non-Tesla vehicles. And starting in 2025, a lot of manufacturers from Ford to GM to Rivian to, it runs the gamut, will begin to manufacture their vehicles, including this connector, in 2025. And so right now, when you go to a charging station, you're going to see a configuration that might look like this. And so you're going to have, okay, there's one location. We got that. There are two stations. Okay, we can see that. 3 ports, and then 4 connectors. So the kind of lexicon here is every port is somewhere you can charge a car, but some ports might have multiple connectors to account for those different ways that cars can charge right now. And so while there are 4 connectors, only 3 cars could charge at the same time, because this one here on the far side, it might have a Tesla connector that's currently being used, and then the other one might be Chatamo in case a Nissan Leaf comes through, needs to charge. However, just to kind of, again, we're just kind of setting the stage here, but many cars at this point in time will come with some sort of charging adapter. And so if you have, for example, an older Ford after 2025 that's still using the CCS combo charger, you would have a connector that would allow you to use chargers that have a Tesla connector. So just kind of a little charging 101 now into some of the meatier stuff we're going to talk about today. So when we're talking about charging planning, we really want to take a look at, yes, what works like street to street in your community, micro level, but we also want to look that it makes sense across the broader region, and there isn't this kind of patchwork of charging just popping up without broader planning in mind. And so a couple things to consider. We're starting out just thinking about charging. You really want to consider, as with any infrastructure project, I'm sure you are all familiar, but your partners and your stakeholders. Who do you need to be engaging from the get-go? So it's easier to get folks on board at the beginning than once you've already planned the thing and decided what to do, which I'm sure, again, working in local government, you all are familiar with. Also think about your neighboring cities, the county that you're in, neighboring counties, state agencies, MPOs, other entities that could really be your allies or your partners in these projects. Also be thinking about those levels of charging, what would make sense, what's needed site to site, who you're trying to serve, how that looks. Also engaging with your utility. Utilities have a vested interest in electric vehicle infrastructure for obvious reasons, as they provide electricity. And so they can be really good partners and also very necessary partners because charging stations won't work if your utility is not on board. And then also looking at the projected demand in your community. So how many charging stations, yes, do you need today, tomorrow, but how many will you need in 5 years or in 10 years? And making sure you are planning for infrastructure that will reflect the demand a couple years down the road, so you're not constantly trying to kind of catch up to where your community is. And then, of course, looking at funding, making sure that all the ducks are in the row, and not that you just have money to dig and then not to maintain the station. So those are some of the things we're going to talk about. But I did want to just, again, I was kind of talking about that broader ecosystem of charging. And so we're looking at this map of kind of the Southwest plus here. Ohio made it on, Michigan folks, I'm sorry, I'm not sure who designed this map, decided to leave y'all out. But you can really see how, you know, highways don't necessarily obey state or community orders, and people using that are going from place to place and moving through, and you see this whole ecosystem, including with utilities and state lines and all these sorts of things that you just need to kind of consider and think about how your charging infrastructure is going to play into this broader ecosystem. So just kind of this map for visual. And then when you're thinking about a site, so specific siting considerations or broad siting considerations, when you're looking at a lot of different sites in your community, is there are a couple things you want to just keep in mind from the get-go. One of those is electrical capacity. So we talked about talking to your utility. They're going to be key here, knowing how much electrical capacity a site has, how much is possible, how much will require an infrastructure upgrade, that sort of thing. You also want to look at existing infrastructure. And so thinking about, yeah, existing charging infrastructure, like what's close by. Maybe this site doesn't need charging, but this site is a charging desert, so we want to look there. But also, are there homes nearby? Are there offices? Like what's around? What's the ecosystem looking like? To that end, you also kind of want to look at amenities. Like, will people want to stay in this area for a couple hours, or will they come to the charging station, get in, get out? Thinking about why people will be in an area, what they'll be doing, time spent can really inform how you develop a charging site. And then you also want to think about accessibility. And that is in terms of people being able to access it, like is it in public parking, that sort of thing. But also making sure people in all types of vehicles with all types of mobility are able to use the chargers, and that the chargers themselves don't present a barrier. And so you're really looking at a number of things, lots of things to keep in mind. There's no hard and fast rubric, but you know, just kind of these things in mind as you're looking around for siting. So to dig in a little bit to this electrical capacity consideration, so the term electrical load capacity really just refers to the total amount of power provided by the main source of electricity for use in a certain building or other infrastructure circuits, including lights, outlets, and then appliances connected to them. And so this will also vary based on if you're in a more urban area, tends to be higher electrical load capacity, versus rural areas may not be able to support something like DC fast charging, and you may be constrained to like level 1 or level 2. So most homes have an average of 100 to 200 amperage capacity. Smaller, older buildings may have more. And here's kind of the listed for what you need for level 1 charging, 12 amps, and then level 2 is 16 to 40 or more amps. And then level 3 would be, or DC fast charging would be beyond that. So I also kind of talked about this a bit, but you also want to look at proximity to existing stations. And so here is a map of Cleveland with all the chargers that are available here using a site called PlugShare. If any of you drive an EV, I'm sure you're familiar with PlugShare. For those of you who don't, it's also kind of can just be a fun tool to use to look and see what chargers are in your area, how they're rated, because folks who go and use chargers can go and rate them, and if they're down all the time, which ones are online, offline, that sort of thing. And so this can be a really good starting point if you're trying to just get a sense of what's in your community. You see here the green ones, I'm pretty sure, are level 2 chargers. The orange ones are DC fast charging. And so when you're looking at planning charging, you don't necessarily need to put a charger in if that area of your community already has access to charging. So one of those things to keep in mind. You also can think about, different users are going to have different needs. So we're looking here at this map of different roads and road levels, and you see here in the kind of off center, there's that blue artery that's the highway, and then from there you see different levels, some like state highways, you have some main roads, and then side neighborhood roads and that sort of thing. So interstate travelers, like folks who are going down that blue interstate highway and not really coming off it, are going to have different needs than people who live here, people who work here, who are using those kind of secondary and tertiary routes to just get around town, live their lives. Whereas the folks on the highway are only going to come off the highway when they need to charge, need to eat, need to, stay in a hotel, whatever that looks like. And so they're going to stick pretty close to that. And making sure you're just keeping in mind what different users need from charging infrastructure. So then for, when you're putting in charging that maybe isn't for those highway users, thinking about what's around. So here's a station in Ohio, I can't remember which city, sorry. But down the block from this station, there's a brewery. Across the street, there's a science museum. And so this charging station wasn't just put here by accident or kind of a roll of the dice. This was put here because they knew people spend time here. And so it makes sense to have a charger where people would leave their cars for a couple of hours. And it wouldn't make sense to have like a DC fast charger here because nobody wants to run out of the brewery after 10 minutes to move their car. And so just kind of creating the infrastructure for the actions of the people that are already there makes sense than trying to change people's behaviors to use the infrastructure, right? So also looking at accessibility considerations, which I touched on. The US Access Board has released guidance that's pretty extensive on how to set up EV charging stations. And so parking stalls should be a certain size for a car and then also a certain size for a van. People should be able to move in and out of their cars to access these chargers. And so you see there's that kind of corridor between the stations. The charging station itself should be operable with one hand and not require any sort of like contorted movement to make sure that they're easy to use for folks of all mobilities. And you can situate your chargers near other accessibility enabled parking spaces, so you don't have to put all of them there. You can put 1 or 2 near those spaces and then 1 or 2 in another spot in the parking site. But just really something to keep in mind, because these chargers need to be, accessible, yes, to drivers in the terms of the US Access Board, but also just accessible to people who want to use them in general, in the more general term of the word. They need to be, as it says here, publicly visible, accessible, and available to drivers for charging 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So you want to make sure that the chargers aren't accidentally, behind a gate that gets locked every weekend, or something like that. So kind of going back to those different charging levels, which I've talked about quite a bit before, but just to kind of more clearly lay it out. Level 1 chargers, you're probably not going to be putting these in for public use. They tend to be used at home. They may be used for slow overnight fleet charging, but they don't make a lot of sense to install, with street parking, because people don't tend to be there for too long. And those are mostly just used at home. So then level 2 chargers, these ones, like I said, used across the gamut. So at home, in public, at work, they would be installed near points of interest, like I said before. And so that would be near a grocery store, near a library, shopping malls, parks. Again, places people are going to park and leave their car for a couple hours, and don't need to go run and move it after 10 minutes or half an hour. So then DC fast chargers, these are used often installed along major highway corridors. So these are kind of your more traditional gas station type fueling setups, where people are going to be in one place 10 minutes to half an hour, really just there to refill their vehicle and get going. And so this could be, like I said, along the highway or at a kind of gas station, fuel station type setup within a community as well. And so some other differences between, we're going to just push level 1 to the side for now and focus more on level 2 and DC fast charging, is the installation cost. And so when it comes down to it, I have this chart here that you can see. Level 2 just tends to be cheaper. And that is largely just because it requires less electricity, it requires less kind of tech, and it's just a lot more cost effective. However, as I've said before, there are situations where DC fast charging just makes the most sense, and you'll want to do that extra investment. For example, if you have folks coming through that interstate highway system, it will be used, as people come through pretty constantly, and you'll be able to recoup costs pretty effectively because it'll be in constant use. But just one of the things to consider when you're deciding charging levels. With costs, bulk buying can decrease costs, which again, I'm sure you're all familiar with. But just this idea of, okay, we maybe want to put 1 charger in, it might be more cost effective to put 3 chargers in instead of deciding every 6 months or every year that you want a new charger. And so again, just coming in, planning for that longer term vision makes a lot of sense here. There's also this component of chargers of networked versus non-networked. And most chargers that we probably think of that are in the public space tend to be networked. So these are known as smart chargers. They connect remotely to a larger network. You can charge users for using the chargers, stop a charge remotely, that sort of thing. And so the main benefit to networked is that you can charge users based on their electricity consumption or how long they're at the charger. You can also tell if they are down or otherwise offline or unable to be used via remote access, and can fix it remotely as well. So you don't have to go to each charger to check and see if it's working. However, network tends to cost more than non-networked. And so non-network chargers are standalone. They don't connect to that network. You can't access them remotely to see if they're working or to fix them. And you can't charge people for using them. And so if you are installing public chargers with the intent of recouping some of that cost through charging users, networked is going to make the most sense. But again, you can just kind of look through how you're going to be using the chargers. And this is just one of a couple considerations to keep in mind. There are also a wide variety of charging station vendors who all have kind of slightly different ways of running things, slightly different infrastructure, and different, benefits to using their products. And that again will be something that you'll have to do, talking to your utility, talking to other folks in the area, maybe seeing if there are local charging station vendors, And again, just benefits and different ownership structures depending on which company you go with. So now funding considerations. So simply charging folks for using the electricity at the station may not have a very quick return on investment. That might take a long time for you to get back the money that you invest into that charging station. And so you can coordinate with utility, again, talking to those utilities for optimal rates and also to build out infrastructure. There are a number of grants. I'll talk about a couple later on, but there's the NEVI program, Volkswagen settlement, other ones that you can access for this sort of thing. There are also federal tax credits. Again, we'll talk about those, but collaborative leasing can help, especially public entities like all of you, monetize those tax credits for charging infrastructure. And 30C is one tax credit that can be applied for charging infrastructure. You also don't have to own the infrastructure yourself. Can outsource that, like I said, working with those charging providers. And there are a number of ownership structures, public ownership, private ownership, partnership. It really runs the gamut. And some organizations like ChargePoint and GreenSpots, they will own their chargers, they'll install them, cover maintenance fees, upkeep, things like that. However, that type of partnership would not allow the city or local government to have any control over prices or functioning of the charger, and the charger wouldn't have any equity in that charging station. So just things to consider as you're thinking about where the money's going to come from, how you're going to pay for that. So digging in a little bit more deeply into the funding side of things, the bipartisan infrastructure law had a number of dedicated funding programs for charging infrastructure, including the National EV Infrastructure Program. NEVI was specifically for electric vehicle charging built out along highways. The Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program, CFI, had a number of competitive grants, some set aside for communities, and then also that had priority for rural and underserved areas. And then a number of other programs here that covered other electric transportation. There are also additional programs that have been in place and were expanded as well, including congestion mitigation, air quality improvement, reducing truck emissions at port facilities, carbon reduction program, deployment of technologies to enhance grid flexibility, grants for energy efficiency improvements. So really it runs across the board here. So specifically for NEVI, if you're looking at kind of that corridor, that highway EV infrastructure, it has a number of location requirements. So like we're saying, along state designated highways, there is a state planning requirement, which I know Ohio has certainly been at the forefront of, but every jurisdiction has to have a plan. There are details for deployment, stakeholder engagement, and they need to be updated each year. There are also a need for specific benefits to be targeted at rural and disadvantaged communities. So those Justice 40 considerations have to be incorporated. And the fuel corridors must allow rural communities to receive some of those stations as well. There are parameters for eligible projects and minimum standards that are released by the Federal Highway Administration that include specifications for charging stations. And the priorities that we are seeing in year 2 NEVI plans will be factoring in additional EV market considerations since the previous year's submissions, ensuring additional state agencies are at the table to just really make sure there's that streamlined collaboration on the transition to EVs, ensure equity partners, local governments, and community-based organizations are at the table. So that would be all of you, and then leverage additional public and private funding sources. A couple more priorities would be considering the pace of medium heavy duty electrification, beginning to identify unique charging scenarios and planning for those solutions, and update state emergency management plans to include NEVI stations and include best practices and lessons learned. So then looking at charging and fueling infrastructure grant, CFI. So this first round was just released recently here. And this funding is discretionary. It's divided between community and additional corridor deployment projects. You can see here how it kind of breaks out from the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's NEVI on one side and there's CFI on the other, then divided into the community program and the corridor program. And so it's available for public and quasi-public entities and allows for additional programming in addition to infrastructure, such as charging education. And so this, there's going to be several rounds. So if you didn't make it through the last one, there will be a lot of other chances for this. Top takeaways from CFI are really, those community versus corridor programs, ensuring your stations are publicly accessible, and seeing that those underserved communities in Justice 40 really see that selection priority, and that collaboration was really encouraged. And so if you have those public-private partnerships in place, that will definitely improve, and regional approaches. And so working with the cities around you, the communities around you, other counties, that sort of thing, to ensure that there's broad regional support for this. So just, as you're looking ahead to stay competitive in these applications, just community engagement. That's very important to emphasize throughout the application. Again, those regional approaches, very, very important there. Emphasizing Justice 40, workforce development, a couple other, just those type of critical topics, making sure those are addressed. And then talking about project teaming, making sure that's in place, and ensuring you're looking at the FAQs and the Q&A. So then when we're looking specifically at site host engagement here, so you're looking at your charging in your community and you want to specifically hone in on those sites, how you're gonna work with those hosts. So things to consider. Ohio communities that I've already worked with, I think have heard me talk about this, but you want to inventory that city and that government owned property, because it can be really just the easiest way forward might be to site chargers at property that the local government already owns. And so we've seen communities site charging at parks, at government buildings. Also heard discussion of siting this charging on vacant lots that may already have electrical infrastructure in place and be near multifamily housing or office buildings or places that will need chargers. So that sort of thing. Looking at those public-private partnerships, if you are, doing this on government-owned property or not. And then if you are looking at non-government owned property, the options for ownership would be, working with the private owner of that property for them to own and maintain the chargers. The organization could own it. And so if you're leasing your building, could purchase and maintain those chargers. And then a third party option would be to have one of those charging companies that I talked about come in and install the chargers and operate them on their own. You also, we've kind of harped on this already, but just like forward thinking in that planning. So looking not just to breaking ground, but far beyond that. So ensuring hosts of the charging site will be able to not only afford the charging infrastructure if they're putting it in, but the electricity, as well as network fees and other things that might come up. Encouraging hosts to collect feedback and data to make sure that their charging infrastructure is performing the way that it was expected to. And making sure that hosts are looking to hire people who can maintain that charger if that's something that they've decided to take on, or ensuring they have a budget for the manufacturer maintenance plan, just to make sure, once chargers in the ground, they're up and running as much as possible. One specific way that we see communities implementing charging at times is charging as a service. And so the site host will, the charging as a service differs from site host owning and operated in that charging as a service, we'll see the charging infrastructure is still in full or in part owned by the site host, but the ongoing operation and maintenance of the charging station is the responsibility of the charging company. And some of the revenue generated by that charging station goes to the charging station network. So again, that company, part of it goes to site host. And then that differs, like I said, from the site host solely owning and operating it, in that the site host would be in charge of owning the infrastructure, operating it, upkeeping it, and then they would also get all of the revenue from it. And so just to kind of really hone in on charging as a service, it's really a method to install and have access to EV stations with limited upfront investment. And so a private vendor would pay for the installation and operation, and would charge the site host a monthly or an annual fee. And then the private vendor would retain full ownership over the charging station. And so there are pros and cons to this approach. Principally, you wouldn't have authority over the price charged. You might not have a super favorable revenue sharing agreement. But you don't have to worry about the maintenance and operations of the charging station itself. So then just looking at some of the tools available, again, as you're planning for charging, as you're thinking about moving forward in this. And some, again, of these Ohio communities will have seen these, or will have seen the results of some of these tools that we use at the EC, but anyone can use them. They're not super complicated or technical. So one of them is the geospatial energy mapping tool, called GEM for short. And it can just show you, it has lots of different layers, different things you can pull in, but can really give you a sense of the infrastructure in the area. Yes, chargers, but also corridors, transmission lines, other electrical infrastructure, and just give you a sense of what's going on in your community, in your region, in your state, and kind of can go as micro or as bird's eye view as you would like of that. You also have the electric vehicle infrastructure projection tool, LIGHT. So this tool, the LIGHT version, is specifically aimed at public entities to be able to use this. Again, it's online, free tool to use. So you would go through, can see how much, you're wondering, how much electric vehicle charging do I need in my area? You can go statewide or metro area. Metro area, I honed in on Michigan's Grand Rapids, Kentwood region here. And then you can estimate how many electric vehicles you'd like to support, and calculate then here the results that will be spit out are how many kinds of charging ports would be needed. And so I plugged in, I think, 10,000 electric vehicles for Grand Rapids, Kentwood, and you see here the majority of this is going to be single family charging ports, so just at home, which the city wouldn't necessarily be planning for or incorporating into charging infrastructure, but you will see here that you would require 281 public level 2 charging ports and then 16 public DC fast charging ports to support the number of electric vehicles that I plugged in there. So you can do that with any community. Change the parameters to match your community and go from there. And then we also have the electric vehicle charging Justice 40 map. And so this is another one where you can zoom in on your community and see specifically which tracks are Justice 40, where you can be siting infrastructure, things to keep in mind there, and just give you a sense of like the makeup of your community at greater detail in this situation. There's also the EC hosts the EV funding finder, and then there's some CFI guidance as well, but the EV funding finder can really let you, select your city, you're interested in charging infrastructure, and then it will spit out some grants and other opportunities such as tax credits and things like that that you can pursue based on the things you select. Okay, so we're talking about future proofing, which again has been a theme throughout this. You don't want to be installing charging infrastructure every 6 months for the next 10 years. That's not fun for anyone. So you kind of want to ensure EV readiness. So this can also be thought of as a dig once policy. And you have these different kind of stages of EV readiness. You have EV capable, EV ready, and then electric vehicle supply equipment installed. And this you can keep in mind for development, for remodels of your own buildings, the construction of single family homes, multifamily, commercial, kind of just anything that would be covered by your zoning and building codes. So EV capable is kind of the lowest tier here. And there would be enough electrical capacity to support future EV charging spots, but nothing's been installed. For EV ready, you would have EV capable requirements are met, but then there's also been wiring and a junction box or a 240 outlet. And so that just, is a little bit more you would do at construction. And then the highest tier is having that charging infrastructure already installed. And the reason to do this is it tends to be much, much cheaper to ensure EV readiness in new construction versus trying to retrofit it. And so you see this case study for San Francisco that was done in 2016. And while this case study is slightly dated, savings are estimated to be around 4 times as much when installing at construction versus post-construction. So you can see here where those costs are coming from, and that it is just makes a lot more sense to do it ahead of time, do it with that new construction, than going back and trying to retrofit later. So the EC has a number of other resources and toolkits. Our website is here. This is a QR code that you can or not use. It's just a fun slide. But always happy to support on things like this. Definitely feel free to reach out with any specific questions. I think Rebecca will be posting these slides, but we are more than happy to be a resource to all of you. And with that, there's my email. So definitely feel free to reach out with any questions. So, or if you have any questions right now, I think we have plenty of time for Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Emily. That was very informational, and I really liked how you stressed reaching out to partners, since that's such a huge piece of it and takes the burden off of us to be doing every single piece of this. So yes, if you have questions for Emily or other communities on the call, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them. Otherwise, you can put them directly in the chat and I can vocalize them for you. I'll leave a little bit of space right now, that awkward silence, to see if anyone speaks up. Otherwise, Emily, I do have some questions for you as well, and for the group as a whole. Okay, hearing none. Emily, I have a question. If just kind of generally, I know that in talking to communities, I kind of hear 2 thoughts, and that some communities would like to be would like to kind of be more involved in the ownership of their charging stations, but other communities are feeling like they want to go more towards, just paying someone to be providing that for them. Have you seen any sort of shift or have any recommendations for communities that are trying to decide between the two? I know you touched on a little bit in your presentation, but.
Yeah, I don't think there's any wrong way to approach it. I mean, different communities just have so many different kind of idiosyncrasies and what they're willing and wanting to take on. I think especially if you have kind of a smaller staff and smaller capacity within your city or your local government, just having somebody else come in and take that on can make more sense. Again, there's also the budgeting concerns too, and what you're hoping to get out of the charger. And so I think what I'm hearing from communities is if they're interested in this as like a revenue sharing and something that they really want to invest in, it makes more sense for the communities themselves to own the infrastructure, run it, that sort of thing. But then there are other communities that know it's needed, but just don't really want to worry about it or mess with it. And so that would be the time to kind of have somebody else come in and just completely run it. I don't know if that's super helpful, but it really does just depend on the community.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it is maybe more of a personal decision, but I think communities like to hear what other communities are doing when making that decision. So that's helpful. And it's very similar to when deciding, what to charge, what type of payment system, whether it's like by the hour or, a one-time charge. I think a lot of communities are thinking about that too in terms of like if we are I hate it's charging for using the station. That we need to get a good term for that. But yeah, people are thinking about that as well. I have a question that I'm going to ask to more of the group because I'm interested to hear about where people on the call are at in terms of their planning for charging stations. Have you just gotten started? Are you, have you finished and you've installed charging stations and maybe you're not sure where to go next? Or I'm interested to hear if anyone has any insights into where they're at, maybe especially talking about what's worked well for you, or if you've come against any barriers that would be helpful to work through. Ryan, I see your hand up. Ryan, you're unmuted. Oh, yeah, well, you're having I was going to say you're unmuted, but I'm not hearing you. So it looks like the city of Sterling Heights does have a plan, which is great to see. Has it been going well, Ryan? You're installing charging stations in public facilities such as parks. Parks are a great place because people do tend to spend time there. So that's great to see. Ryan, have you come across like any barriers as you've been going through this plan with a public-private partnership? That's great. So sorry, Ryan, I'm asking you to like be typing really quickly, but I'm wondering who in your public-private partnership is in charge of like maintaining and the upkeep of your stations. Ryan saying the city development and DPW are working on the contract and the contractor will do the maintenance. That's great. Well, and that's something that is good to think about is if there are things that you specifically want out of the relationship, making sure that it's put into that contract so that it's written and favorable to you. Emily, I think, oh, well, I'll read this comment from Ryan. It says, we had one contract issue. The company tried to establish a monopoly on all charging stations in the city. We worked with them and prevented that. Make sure to read your contracts well. That's a really good point, Ryan. And that's a case in point where, digging through it with a fine-tooth comb and making sure that you are advocating for what you want and what's best for your city. Because the charging, the public or the private entity will be trying to do what's best for them. And so you want to make sure that you are also advocating for your community in that. Emily, I know that we were on a call a few weeks ago that was, and I think this is what it was, so please correct my memory, but there were some resources that they were looking for, like a draft RFP or contract for public-private, this public-private partnership. Can you remind me of that?
Yes.
Is that what I'm thinking of?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember which community that was. But yes, there can be example RFPs, and I know I have some resources, and Rebecca, we can send them out too, of looking at what other communities have done to solicit charging companies to come in to do that kind of public-private partnership or private ownership, depending on how you structure it. And so having those example RFPs, because that's something other communities have done, can be a really helpful starting point. And I can go see if I can dig those up as well.
Right. Yeah. And Ryan, maybe if you wouldn't mind throwing in the chat, did you have an RFP that you put out for this public-private partnership, or like how you went about that? In the meantime, I will just say that I will be sharing the slides that Emily put out or had today in two places. I'll send them out in an email, as well as we post everything to that EV Smart website. I'll put a link to it in the chat. But the webinar recording will be posted there, as well as the slide deck and links to the different the great tools that Emily brought up today, as well as to the Electrification Coalition's website that has a host of other resources that are available to you. Yeah, Ryan, if you have an example that you don't mind sharing, that would be a really good resource for the rest of the folks on the call. If you don't mind us sharing that out with this group, that would be great. But in the meantime, there's just a few minutes left here, so I will share my screen. And I have one last kind of follow-up slide to kind of wrap us up. I'm really quickly, though, putting in the EV Smart website into the chat so that you all have it. But for next steps, as you all know, this is a monthly webinar. We have our webinars on the last Friday of the month at this same time. And, we all are looking forward to seeing you next month. Our topic will be about utility engagement, how we can be talking to our utilities. As Emily mentioned, they're a really strong partner in this, and how we can work with them to be getting funding and to be thinking about how we can be installing these charging stations. So Friday, March 29th, the same time, we will be talking about utility engagement. In the meantime, we are here to support you and to help you as you're working through those different EV-related actions that we discussed at your individual meetings. So if you have any questions, if you need support, if you need resources, please reach out to myself, reach out to Emily, as well as for our folks in Michigan, to Charles Griffith. We're all here to help you achieve these different actions. And so one of the best ways that we can help you is by you telling us how we can help you. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. And we look forward to working with you and seeing you next on the next webinar. So thank you all so much for being here today. And we hope that you have a good rest of your day. Perfect. Well, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all. Feel free to reach out with any questions.
Yes, the Electrification Coalition also has that drive tool for fleet analyses. And so if you have any questions about that as well, they're more than happy to help. Thank you, Emily, for joining us. I realized I just forgot to thank you for your great presentation, but thank you for that as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah.
So
great. Yeah, and your voice sounds much better. So that
I feel much better.
Sounds like you're feeling better. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Just in time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, bye, y'all. Thank you.
Bye. Have a good weekend.